So, if you have not seen the latest news, Amazon recently announced that they are going to be requiring all employees to return to the office at least 3 days a week. Now, excuse me. Now, let me say, I will be the first to say I am not a big fan of mandatory employee policies. So I'll open with that. But the point of this is not necessarily to talk about my opinion on whether or not requiring employees to be in the office 3 days a week is a good idea or not. That's really not the point. The point is this type of thing is a trend that's continuing to rise as companies are coming back through the pandemic and trying to decide how do they handle employees and where they work. And one of the ways they're scrambling for solutions is to try and mandate their way through this. This is putting managers in a really uncomfortable position oftentimes because they're stuck between the company and their teams and their way of working. And this is honestly, it's a disappointing trend, especially given the continued data around the fact that employees want more autonomy. And these kinds of moves send really strong messages that we're going to give you less autonomy. You have less power as a manager to run your team. All that to say, for managers, there's some really good news in all of this. The good news is you are the best person to help your team navigate this. The bad news is you're the best person to help navigate this. So there's a lot riding on your shoulders. And I know I've talked to a number of managers in recent months as this has been a rising trend, trying to figure out, how do I handle this? What is an effective way to work through this for myself, but then also at the same time to do this with my teams? Because there is legitimate risk of major disruption to your teams if you don't handle this well. The good news is you have a lot more power than you realize. Even if you don't feel like it, even if you don't think you do, even if you're feeling right now, if you're at Amazon or somewhere else, if you're feeling like, well, this is completely outside of my control, you actually have a lot more control than you may think. And I'm hoping that this video will help you know how to navigate that well, not only so that you can feel more empowered and emboldened, but also you can help your team through this whole thing, because this can be a very disruptive change. Now, the other thing I will add is I would encourage managers to take a look at this, whether you're a manager of a flexible team, a hybrid team, or not. Sometimes I get pushback on this going, well, I run a hourly team or things like this, but you're going to see there may be some value in this, not only around this topic, but just in terms of managing through these kinds of things. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I think the first thing that I would recommend to any manager going through this is you have to recognize you have emotions in response to all of this. Do not pretend that you don't. I grew up in a funeral home, and I can tell you right now, denying feelings, it doesn't land well at all. It ends up coming out in a lot of other different ways. The reality is these kinds of mandates send a very strong message to managers and employees. Whether intentional or not, it sends the message that things aren't going how we want, and you can't be trusted to lead the work of your team. And a lot of times that's just not necessarily the intended message, but that's the message it's often received with. And you've got to navigate. Are you feeling that way? How are you feeling? Is it having you question your role? You have to work through all of this. Now, the one thing I will say is you need to find someone you can trust to talk to about it. And do not let that be someone on your team. Do not let that be someone in your work sphere. That is not an area you want to get into, but I think you ultimately need to process whatever feelings it is. And the one thing I will say as it comes to processing your feelings is do not make any decisions in these moments as you're processing through your feelings. I will share a personal story. There was an organization I was with once. They made kind of a off the cuff mandate, announced it out to the organization, and in an emotional kind of flurry of things, I made a very irrational decision, ultimately only to have the mandate reversed, and ended up having to completely walk back from everything that I had gone through, some of which I was unable to do. So if anything, what I would say is hold on any decisions that may be going through your head and take the time to just process your emotions, work through them, figure out where you're at. One thing I will encourage managers to do in this, and I want you to listen carefully on this one, is prepare yourself for a departure. If this is something that is affecting you and you're thinking, I don't know if this is an organization I want to be with long term, it's a real possibility you may need to consider, depending on how the organization takes this mandate, carries this mandate forward. Is that the kind of leadership you want to be under in an organization? Again, don't make any hasty decisions, because organizations are trying to do their best. You really need to let this play out and see, well, what kind of organization is this really? Was this just an attempt to control some things that were outside their control, or is this really the approach and style of the organization? And if it is, it may not be a place you want to be. Managers having to be accountable for all of the results, yet being given none of the autonomy required to lead their teams. Is that an organization you want to be with? Now, the thing I say with this is being prepared for a potential departure is very different from absolutely making the decision that you're going to depart. This is one of the areas that a lot of times when I talk to people, they wait until they have to go before they start preparing. And I think this may be an opportunity, if you're in an organization that's making one of these kinds of mandates, to say, maybe this is an opportunity for me to be better prepared for a departure. Doesn't mean that you have to depart, doesn't mean you have to make that conclusion, but it is an opportunity that you may want to say, am I in a position that I could transition if I needed to? And what I can tell you is it actually better prepares you for these kinds of disruptive announcements, these kinds of disruptive team changes. Whenever you're in it, one of the best pieces of career advice I got was always be prepared to leave. And in doing so, it helps tremendously not be swayed by some of these big shifts in organizations. Now, one last thing I will say in terms of managing your personal feelings and reactions, don't do that with your team. I mentioned that before about, finding someone you can trust, that it not being part of your team. You have to remember, as the leader of your team, you are the peacemaker. It does not matter what you think. I mean, it does, but you cannot pick sides, especially in front of your team. Even if you're someone who's maybe on a team that doesn't have flexible working arrangements right now, it doesn't matter. There are still going to be people on both sides with feelings. There are going to be people who are going to have a very strong reaction to this kind of mandate, positive and negative. And you need to represent them fairly. And if you're showing a strong bias towards one side, you are going to isolate the people that have a different opinion because of the power dynamics you have as their manager. So do everything you can to not let your own personal feelings, your own personal bias come out in that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can do that in the next part. The other thing too is, remember, you're setting the tone. Everyone is watching you as a people leader. Even if you feel like, oh, nobody's going to notice, or I'm talking to this separate group of people, people are paying attention to how you respond, and you do not want to get sucked into drama. You do not want to get sucked into complaining fests, things like that. So manage your feelings, deal with your feelings, figure out where you're landing on this, get yourself prepared for a transition. Not that you have to make a transition. And again, avoid all sorts of irrational decisions that you may make, and then just be prepared to enter into this with your team as a peacemaker, trying to navigate it. Okay, so with that, let's transition. So then what do you do about the team? Well, the first thing is you need to do something, and you need to do it sooner than later. I think one of the worst things you can do when these kinds of major corporate announcements, and this doesn't just apply to a return to office mandate, but any significant org change, you need to address it with your team sooner than later. whether or not your team is impacted. And I think this is one of the things that sometimes can get missed. Well, none of my team is working remotely now, or I'm in a role that nobody has flexible work arrangements. It still doesn't matter how you handle this situation. Remember, everyone's watching. How you handle this sets the tone for how you lead a team. And you have an opportunity to really build trust with the team by taking a proactive stance and bringing this up in a team setting and talking about it. And not taking action is an action. It is demonstrating to your team that you are not taking action when major things happen. And that is not a reputation you should have, nor is it the responsibility you should be playing with your team. So find some time, pull the team together to talk about this. Now, what I will say when it comes to how you represent the company, I have seen over the years people take the interpretation that as a manager, you just got to toe the company line. You've just got to represent everything that the company says and blindly agree with what they're doing. The number of people I've talked to who have left their job because that is what their manager has done is astounding. You do not need to just blindly support. Now, there's a way you do this, though, without throwing shade on the company. Because the reality is the company's in a tough spot. And that's one of the things, there's a lot more nuance to this. When I see oversimplified reactions to these types of big things, it's that people aren't fully appreciating the complexity of the problem and what a company is trying to do to navigate this. And I think that's one of the best ways you can lead this with your team, is not to pick sides, not to throw shade, try and either isolate yourself from the company or totally align yourself with the company, but to be able to talk about some of the complexity and recognize that they're doing the best that they can, but acknowledge that this is going to create mixed feelings. Acknowledge the fact that, and be proactive. Don't wait for somebody to have to share they have mixed feelings or are having a reaction to it. Acknowledge that some people will, because whether they are on your team or not, someone is. And acknowledging that helps humanize the fact that this is not an us versus them. This is not this camp versus that camp, that really there are good people who are just struggling with this right now. And create some space for people to share, but be okay that people may not. I think sometimes there's this tendency to try and either ignore and not create space and take this lack of response because you created no space as, oh, everything's fine, when it's not. Or we can try and force it. People may not be in a position or have a level of trust where they feel comfortable doing that. Another thing that I would encourage in that team setting is be sure to emphasize, and again, this applies even if you're in a hourly manufacturing, non-traditional hybrid type role, that this is not a shift away from flexibility. And I say flexibility in air quotes, because a lot of times flexibility, if you haven't seen, check out my other video. This isn't saying flexibility is only remote, hybrid, in-office, non-in-office type of a thing. Flexibility is much broader than that. And what you want to emphasize is that you as the leader are still prioritizing flexibility. And in many ways, the company is still trying to prioritize flexibility because they recognize people want flexibility. The data says so. I have yet to encounter in a data, the vast majority of employees want greater flexibility, even if that doesn't mean hybrid working or remote working. They want greater autonomy and more of that. So you want to make sure you're emphasizing that this is something that will continue to be a priority. This mandate does not change that. You also want to highlight you're going to continue to explore ways to find more of that flexibility. Again, reinforcing that don't take a company mandate saying people must be in the office this many days of a week, is that the company is thereby transitioning away from what employees are telling them, which is they want more autonomy. What you want to do is disconnect this mandate from that. And again, tie it back to just the nuance of companies trying to figure out how best to handle these situations. Something else that's going to be really important in that team setting is that you assure people you will not be taking immediate action. Going back to what I said at the very beginning in the introduction, you have a lot more power than you may realize. And just because a mandate comes out does not mean you have to take and figure this all out ASAP. I think sometimes there's this pressure, this expectation that's put on managers that you got the email yesterday, so do you have this fully figured out and have you implemented it for your team? You do not need to do that, and let go of any pressure that you're putting on yourself to try and respond to that. And I will tell you that I would give that same advice even if you said, well, the email had a specific date we have to have this by, or there were threats. I think back to the Elon Musk threats of you've got till this long and then you have to sign this piece of paper if you're not going to do it. You have way more autonomy to tell your team, we are going to figure this out together. Don't take this email and think that this is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to best understand what's going on with our team. We're going to determine how we need to work moving forward, and we're going to make the case for that and work through this together. So again, just reassure your team, just like I said, don't make any irrational decisions for yourself. You need to reassure the team. We as a team are not going to make any irrational or disruptive decisions, because the performance and the well-being of your employees is far more important than responding to any off-the-cuff announcement that comes up. The other thing I would say is don't just do this one time. Don't pull people together, have this one meeting, and then let it fall off the radar completely. I'm going to talk about talking about this with individual team members, and that is something you need in this team setting to let them know that you are going to talk to them one-on-one. You're going to have a conversation with them about it so that they can prepare. Again, I told you, create space for people to have a reaction, to share their feelings, but people may not be ready yet. They may still be processing this themselves. And so you need to give them that space. But by letting them know you'll be bringing this up in a one-on-one, you're setting expectations that there will be some follow-up conversation on this, giving them time to process, to prepare, to decide what do they feel, how do they want to process. And again, share some of your insights, some of the things you're going through. I think vulnerability and authenticity goes a long way in these kinds of things. And let them know you will keep them informed on the status as things progress. Again, reassuring them that, yes, I understand this has come out. Yes, we're working through it, but we're going to work through this as a team. You do not want your team to feel like you're just blindly following orders. They want to feel like you have their back and that you are going to do everything you can to help them through this significant transition. Even if you're listening going, it's not a significant transition for us. There is a lot more psychologically going on when companies do these kinds of things than meets the eye oftentimes. So with that, let's transition over to the next piece, which is talking to those individual team members. So you've got this group setting, you've hammered out in the group setting, again, proactively said, we're going to talk about this. Now we've moved on to these individuals. First thing I will say is let me say this first. If you don't have one-on-ones with your direct reports, fix that now. Fix it now. If you do not have standing one-on-ones with your direct reports, that is a manager 101 absolute must. If you do not have one-on-ones with your direct reports, or you do not make it a priority to consistently stick with them, if you're that manager that's constantly moving them, canceling when anything else comes up on your schedule, stop that behavior now. So assuming you don't, and if you don't, you're changing that behavior because of this video. So now you got that. In those one-on-ones, create intentional space for this conversation. You told them you would in the team setting, create the space for it, and create it first. Don't put it at the end of the agenda. If we have time, we'll get to this type of a thing. We all know what happens with that. Everything takes precedent, and then that gets bumped. And I think that's just a recommendation I'm going to make on any one-on-ones. Make a point at the beginning to make time for how are they doing, where are they at? In this case, how are you doing in response to this mandate? Don't ask it as a yes or no question. Things like, are you feeling all right with this whole company mandate thing? You're not opening the door for a dialogue. You're opening the door to yeah, I'm fine. no, I'm not. Or who's going to say no, they're not when you ask it like that? So it's really important that you're asking an open-ended question saying, how are you feeling about the announcement that just came out? How are you feeling about the idea of everyone having to return to work? What are your thoughts on that? Give them a chance to have a reaction, create that space for it. Now, that said, if the people you're talking to seem totally fine and it does not seem to be a big issue for them, if anything, they may seem confused as to why you're making a big deal. Don't press on it. Don't try and create something that isn't there. Pushing too hard can be extremely obnoxious. I know personally there's nothing worse than when I'm actually doing fine and somebody keeps insisting that I shouldn't be fine or I'm not fine. That doesn't make me want to open up more or talk more. If anything, it shuts me out. So don't overpress on this, but just make sure you keep the door open. Even if somebody says, no, I'm fine, it's not a big deal, I'm not impacted by this type of a thing. Just let them know, well, if that changes, things like that, feel free to, bring it up, and I may ask again down the road to see how you're doing with things. But again, don't overpress on that. If they are concerned, if when you open this door, it is clear that there is a whole lot coming behind it. And again, that may be whether their situation is affected or not. Remember, just because their situation is affected isn't directly affected, doesn't mean that a company making an announcement dictating to employees the way they work does not have them feeling uncertain about the company or the organization. So if you sense any sort of concerns, talk through that. Do your best to gauge how strong are these? Is this just one of those, I wasn't really a fan, it made me feel a little off type of thing? Or is this strong? You can get a read that, man, I think this is really disrupting, how they're thinking about the organization, their confidence in where we're going, things like that. In those moments, I think the thing I would really encourage is reinforce that you're going to work together to figure out a plan and be proactive on this. Don't wait until you sense that they need you to lean in. Just like don't wait to do a team meeting until the team seems like they're really unsettled. Do it first. Be proactive. Let this individual know, hey, listen, we're going to work through this. Even if it's just, I'm unsettled about it. Well, then let's work a plan. Let's figure out what would make you more settled. What kinds of things would you like to see to feel more comfortable and not be as concerned about these kinds of things? The last thing I will add on this one is, and this may sound a little bit crazy, but I would encourage managers to talk openly. That this may have open the door of, if you sense that they are unsettled with this, open the door of asking about, does this have you considering new employment? Now that may sound like a terrible idea, but I'm telling you, this is a positive step. It's like I've got kids who are in their early tween years. It's like having uncomfortable conversations about them getting to those ages. You don't want to wait until they come to you about it. You want to lean into this, because the reality is announcements like this can make people start questioning whether they want to stay with this organization. And what you don't want to be is on your heels trying to react once something happens. So open the door to it. Open the door to the fact that I understand that for some people, this is going to have them reconsidering their employment here. Is that where you're at? What you don't want is to push that into the shadows. And I think this is a huge mistake managers often make, is because it's an uncomfortable conversation to talk about not being happy in your role, not being happy with the company, we tend to try and avoid it. And as a result, we shove it into the shadows, but it doesn't go away. If anything, you're almost fueling the possibility that it's going to get arms and legs and teeth and hair when you don't want to talk about it, versus you bring it into the light and you say, listen, I know this is something that for some people is going to make them reconsider, is this the right place for me? And I want you to know that that's an okay feeling to be having, but I want to be part of that conversation and be involved in you processing through that. Now, again, if they're telling you they're fine, don't try and make this about that. This is the worst thing you can do. But if you really get a sense by paying attention to the cues that this person is really disrupted by what just happened, lean into this a little bit. Lean in, ask them to keep you in the loop. Let them know that considering new things because of things like this is not bad. I would encourage them as a manager, the same thing I encouraged you, encourage them not to make irrational decisions, to process through this. Let them know you can be one of those people that they can trust to talk this through if they're comfortable. And here's something else that may sound counterintuitive. It's also okay to let them know that interviewing for other possibilities, exploring a new opportunity is okay. It's okay to do that, because here's the thing that I will just tell you right now as a manager. If you handle this situation really well, if you handle them having concerns about the organization, if you handle the possibility of them going and interviewing somewhere else just to explore, there's a really good chance you can positively influence this, that those interviews may actually be a retention driver for you. Because if you're handling this really well, if you're open about, I understand you may be considering new things, I understand you may need to interview and just explore some other possibilities. I want you to know I'm here for you. I'm supportive of that and am ready to ask any questions. You actually have a chance that they may go out, explore the fact that, you know what, these opportunities, they're pretty comparable to what I have now, but boy, I've got a manager who has my back, who is supportive of me even doing this and is there for me. And there's a good chance that that may actually make them go, you know what, I actually don't want to go somewhere else. I actually want to stay right where I am, because having this manager, I mean, you hear the quote, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And this is a chance for you to use this to retain the talent on your team by showing them you are okay with them having questions, having concerns, questioning whether this is the right thing. That's not a bad thing. It's just a natural step in the process. And you, as their manager, are there to support them through that transition. So I think that's my suggestions to you as you think about, how is it that you want to go through this process with your individual team members. Now, the next step is, after you've had the chance to talk with your team, talk with them on an individual basis, the next thing I'm going to encourage you to do is come up with a plan. After you've gotten a feel for what's going on with your team, what are their reactions, where are some of the pain points and pressure points that you're experiencing, you need to create a plan for what you think this could look like. Now, maybe this return to work mandate is not a big deal. Okay, great. Then there's really not much planning. Maybe it only affects certain people on your team a lot. Then you need to come up with a plan on what you're thinking about how it may work with them. Maybe it affects a lot of them. In that case, you've got a lot more planning to do. I would not say this needs to be completely comprehensive, but you need to have some sort of plan based on what you've learned from this. And this is going to prepare you for the next step, which I'll talk about in a little bit. One thing in that planning, though, is regardless of what your plan is, going back to not just towing the company line, keep flexibility as a top priority. Even if ultimately returning to the office for several days out of the week is what your plan is, you've come to alignment on that with the team, make sure you are still emphasizing new and different ways to prioritize flexibility. Again, this is a top driver for engagement and retention. You don't want people thinking that as a manager, you're only concerned about checking the box. All you care about is making sure you're giving only what's required by the company. But instead, you're saying, I want to make this a priority and find as many and as creative as possible different ways to offer flexibility. So if you're working within this mandate, well, that's fine, but we don't just want that to be the bare minimum. We want to say we want to go beyond that and think of different things we can do. And again, go check out my How to Do Flexibility with Your Team if you haven't seen it, because you may be thinking about this much smaller than you need to. I would also, in your plan, and this is again going to help you for the last step in this, design it for intentional flexibility points. Now, the reason I say this is the next step is going and talking to your manager about it. And what you want to do is, if you design for the breaking points, the points where you go, okay, here's what my plan is, but if I had to flex, this is where I would want it to flex. You want to design for that. So instead of waiting for someone to react to your plan and tell you where those flex points are, you want to have some intentional points built into that plan that if you're getting pushback, you can go, well, what if we twisted here? What if we bent right here? What if we turned this knob? So that you're actually controlling where the flexibility is. So going in with your ideal plan with some intentional points where you know this may flex. So that's a relatively simple one. I think, again, you don't need this to be comprehensive. Here's every single bit of inner working. I think the other thing with this is you're going to want to talk about the fact that this plan, you're going to need to be creative with it. You're not going to have all the answers out of the gate and know exactly what it is you're going to need to do. So be prepared for that. Now, last and final thing that I'm going to say is talking to your manager is another consideration you're going to have to make when it comes to these work from home mandates, any sort of big company mandate. If possible, I would strongly recommend you delay bringing this conversation up. And you're going to hear if you bring this conversation up with your manager, delay it until you've had the chance to talk to your team. The last thing you want to do is try and have that conversation and you're already getting ideas and direction and trying to think this through before you've had the chance. You're more likely to react and have a response and maybe inadvertently shoot yourself in the foot if you haven't talked to your team and had feedback, input, had a chance to process a plan, had a chance to process your own emotions, had a chance to go through all those things. You want to make sure you've gone through those steps before you even consider approaching this with your manager. It's going to give you data on your team. It's going to give you a chance to process and stabilize your emotions and your reactions. It's going to help you take some of that emotion out of it. So if at all possible, don't, and I think that's sometimes the tendency is these things pop off. Some of the first things we want to do is approach our manager with, boom, here's how I'm feeling, or here's what I'm thinking, or here's my concerns with what I see in all this. Resist the urge to do that and pull back. Take some time to take a deep breath, process, talk to your team, talk yourself through it, all this stuff. So again, hold on any sort of immediate engagement with your manager. When it comes to talking to your manager, I'm just going to say, do it very carefully. You run the risk by doing this of opening up more problems than your solution, than you're actually solving for. Going to your manager to talk about this for your team and talking to your manager about how you're going to run your team or your concerns about this. I don't want to say you don't ever need to do it, but ask yourself some really thoughtful questions first is your manager super engaged with how you run the team anyway? Are they really close in proximity? Are they seeing how you're running the team? Are they going to notice if you make significant changes or you're not necessarily following things exactly as demanded? One of the big mistakes I see sometimes is I've seen leaders whose managers are, not involved whatsoever, and they bring everything and basically open up all this stuff for their manager to react to, when had they not brought it up in the first place, their manager may not have even cared, noticed, or paid any attention to it. So ask yourself, are they even honestly going to notice or have any sort of indications into the decisions I'm making on running the teams? Going back to, you have more power than you realize. I think sometimes we ask for permission for things that we maybe don't need to. We want to try and get approval on decisions that maybe your leader, and maybe part of the reason you're not seeing the career success that you want is you're constantly asking for validation on things that, as a people leader, you just should take responsibility for. So if your manager's not engaged in this, the right thing to do may be to say, I'm just going to make decisions for what I need to do with my team, and I'm going to ask for forgiveness if somebody gets upset by it or if questions come up later. I'm not necessarily going to bring a bunch of things in, because not everything, even if it's a mandate or coming from a place, not everything is necessarily, it's a guideline. It's like the speed limit, drive 55. Who's actually driving 55? It's a guideline type of a thing. And depending on your manager, they may be fine with you driving 62 in this, right? You know your manager better than anybody else. So take this advice carefully. But what I would say is, I've seen way too many people create more problems than solutions by engaging with their manager, bringing things up when they should have just left it alone, figured out what they need to do with their team, and figured out. Just as an example, think of travel, company travel. Pretty much every job description I've ever encountered has some sort of thing, travel required up to blah, blah, blah percentage. Is somebody going through and policing your T&L to say, hey, I noticed that the job description says this is a 25% travel. This person hasn't been traveling in X long. No. So the same may be true depending on your manager and depending on how strong your company's taking a stance on this. They may be saying this is the requirement. We're not really going to follow up on this. This is more of a guideline type of a thing. I think sometimes when these mandates come out, though, people react to their perception of the messaging instead of, all right, is this really something that, is going to be an enforced mandate, or is this more of the speed limit for the organization? If you do ultimately decide to bring this up with your manager, though, get a read on their reaction. Just like you're trying to get a read on your team's reaction, and maybe even before you bring this up with your manager, try and get a read on their reaction to things. How are they responding to things? Are they having a really staunch, yes, we're going to make sure this happens throughout the team? Are they kind of avoiding it? Do they not really care? Are they remote all the time too? Are they kind of trying to avoid the whole situation? I mean, your situation, so I don't want to prescribe to you exactly what to do other than try and get a read on your boss. How are they responding? How are they feeling about it? If possible, my recommendation, again, is going to be go about your business and ask for forgiveness versus permission. Now, that may feel uncomfortable for some folks. That tends to be my MO, is I'm assessing the risk. If there's not a high risk situation, something I really think may blow up, I'm just going to do it and then see what happens. Now, I am not suggesting, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you see this mandate and you go, piss off, forget it. I'm going to go in rebellion. I'm going to rebel against this. And certainly, if you ultimately decide to say, you know what, for the way my team works, we're going to do things a little bit differently, I would not wave your flag banner around telling everybody that the mandate came out and I'm rebelling against this. We're not going to do that for my team. First of all, one, you're just looking to draw unnecessary attention to yourself. But two, you run the risk of just isolating and, you don't want to get involved in the whole extreme camps of, is it good? Is it bad? What side are you on type of a thing? Remember, you're an ambassador for your company. So you don't want to be perceived as the one going, I'm fighting against the man, trying to go against this whole policy. Instead, you want to say, hey, we're doing the best we can. You're a peacemaker. You're a peacemaker. You're acknowledging the company's trying to navigate this complex thing. You're quietly just deciding, as the leader of the team who's been hired by the company to run the team to its optimal performance, that's exactly what you're doing. So, like I said, I'm not suggesting you rebel or overtly just go out on a limb to push against it. At the same time, you may just say, you know what, I need to figure this out. And it doesn't, this might just be hype. This might be a flavor of the week. I get they're trying to solve for some things. So they're making a big sweeping hyperbole to try and get everybody to do something. And it's going to fall back into status quo soon enough. So I'm not going to call a lot of attention to it. And if you think that's not really how these things work, just read your company handbook. Take a look in there at how much inconsistency you will see between what the handbook says is required and how everything has to go and everything that has to happen and how things actually play out in real life. You'll quickly see that, okay, there are things happening. And you know what? Actually, as a manager, I have a lot more autonomy, a lot more authority to decide how I run my teams than maybe I even give myself credit for. I would encourage people to be emboldened and empowered to do that. Just don't draw a lot of attention to the fact that that's what you're doing. That quiet, subtle peacemaker work of, I'm just going to do what I need to do to make sure my team's running optimally, and I'll have some plans in place in case something pops up. Now, here's the thing, okay? If you're a manager and your manager is draconian, authoritative, they're firm on this mandate, They're going to put the hammer down. They're doing the toe the company line type of approach. Well, this is what the company said. We're expecting it. And you're getting the sense this is really going to go down a path you may not want it to. Be prepared to stand your ground and represent the team needs of your team. If you are not comfortable doing this, I'm just going to say this to you. If you're not comfortable doing it, you don't belong in the role you're in. If you are not willing to stand up for what's best for your team, who you know better than anyone else in the company, what your team needs, what they need to be effective. You know how to run your team better. I'm not saying you know how to do it perfect. So don't take that and go, yeah, I am the best. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, out of the entire company, certainly more than a senior executive team who's making this decision from who knows where, you know better how to run your team. And if knowing better, being closer to your team, having to take the accountability and potential fallout of a bad decision here, if you're not willing to stand up and defend your team the way you're running your team and the best interest and well-being of your team, you shouldn't be a people manager. So reconsider your career decisions. If you're going, now it's a different thing to go, man, I'm really uncomfortable with this. I hear what you're saying. I want to do that. I'm really uncomfortable. That is a very different thing. But if your attitude is, I'm not going to do that. My job is just to make sure you don't belong in people leadership. So just be ready, because there is the possibility, and I've dealt with this many times throughout my career, where you may have a manager who is not a manager and this goes back to your fallout plan, right? You may be going, maybe this is a chance for me to see what I'm really dealing with. And is this really where I want to be? But don't go there right away. Again, no irrational decisions. Be prepared to go head to head with your manager, and not adversarial. Strip the emotions out, but just talk objectively about it. Even if your manager is totally dead set on, we are going to make this happen, bring this up, highlight the risks. This is why you want to push this conversation out until you've had the chance to process your emotions, understand your team. This is going to allow you to have an informed business performance conversation, not an emotional debate around whether or not you think what the company's doing is the right move. That is the last place you want this conversation to go, is a debate on opinions on flexible work from home mandates, right? The last place you want this to go is that, because the bottom line is they have the power dynamic. They are your boss. So you don't want it to go there, because whether you agree with their opinion or not, their opinion technically from an authority standpoint trumps yours. So don't let it go there. Instead, keep it focused on the facts, the reality. Talk about what's going on. Talk about the health of your team. Talk about the performance of your team. Talk through where your team's at in response to this and how they're feeling, and highlight any major risks that may pop up as a result of blindly following this thing. Walk through your plan. And again, if you did this right, you've built intentional breakpoints. So what you're coming to the table with is your ideal plan, so that even if your manager has a reaction to it, you can go, hey, I want to work with you. What if we do this? But you're breaking it where you intended it to break, instead of waiting for your manager to tear you apart a plan. Be sure to push for taking things as it comes. I think that's one of the biggest things that a lot of times causes conflict for these, is that we're trying to figure it out perfect before we do anything. And instead, just push for things. That can be one way to work back from a manager who may be really staunch on something, is to say, hey, rather than just reacting and doing something, can we take this one step at a time? I've thought through some things. Here's some of the real risks I'm seeing. Here's how I'm seeing this possibly working out. Could we try this? Could we see if this might work for us? And then take it one step at a time and go from there. And you are in a much better position to be successful in this conversation, even with a jackwagon of a boss, if you strip out the emotions, acknowledge the fact that they have the power dynamic, and work with them on, and again, keep it focused on team health and team performance. Keep it focused on that. Do not let it get distracted on opinions and things like that. Keep it focused there, and you have a much better chance of coming out of that conversation successfully. Now, worst case scenario, and then I'm going to wrap this up. It may not go well. It may not go well. You may ultimately feel like you are in a position where you are hands tied. I can't do anything. My manager's not supportive. The company's not supportive. Be ready to be pushed out, but be confident in that decision. And here's what I say. I say this is worst case planning for this because the reality is the likelihood that you taking a stand for the health of your team when you're being flexible, when you're being proactive, when you're focusing on performance, when you're doing all the right things, the probability that you standing up for your team and their well-being is going to result in you being terminated is very low. I will just say that. Now, I'm not going to promise you, oh yeah, don't worry about it, you'll never get fired. No, companies make stupid decisions all the time. But the probability that that's going to happen is low. The probability that that's going to happen instantly or quickly is even lower. So even if it does come to that, the probability it's going to happen in that meeting, you're going to be terminated, right? It's very slim. So you can de-risk this and say, okay, the likelihood of that happening is small. The probability that I'm going to be terminated, period, is low. Chances are you have a much higher probability it's going to be fine and you're going to be able to run things as you are. But ultimately, hey, this may lead in either the company making a decision about you, which this is why, going back to the beginning, be prepared to leave at any point. That is the best career strategy you can ever have, is to be content and working hard with where you're at, while at the same time always being prepared. But it's harder than you realize to get rid of somebody. And so even if you've got an Elon Musk who's making irate things and threatening people and telling them they have till this day to do anything, it's not that easy to actually terminate people. And even if companies ultimately that's the decision they want to go, it's probably going to take longer. And what I would say is, if you're really getting the sense that that's where it's going, negotiate your exit. Can probably do a conversation just on that topic, but they're changing your work requirements. They're changing the dynamics of your role as a people leader. They're changing the working dynamics of your team. If you've been working in a flexible situation and now they've made a snap decision to change that, are they enabled to do that? Absolutely. However, you also have rights in that to be able to say, listen, you've changed things and I want to talk about this, and here's my feelings and here's my concerns. And again, one of the things I would just encourage everybody on is you have a lot more power than you realize, and you have a responsibility to do what's best for your team. So hopefully you have found this helpful. Hopefully this will help you navigate potential return to work mandates and any other mandates you may be facing. Have a good one.